Hi everyone and welcome. I'm down here in my wormery and I'm going to tend to my two oldest bins. And my two oldest bins are right here. They have red wigglers in them. And the oldest of them is 110 days old. And the next oldest bin is 74 days old. And it wasn't very long ago that I was seeing a lot of moisture in the older of the two bins. So in went a lot of dry leaves in an attempt to try to sop up the moisture. And with all that extra leafy material in there, it started to seem like it's going to take a little bit longer for this bin to complete because of all that extra bedding type material that's in there now. And I was starting to think that the 74-day-old bin was really looking like it might get to the finish line sooner than the older of the two bins. So even in my last video, I had toyed with the idea of maybe not even feeding this 74-day-old bin anymore and just sort of sending it down that road of being prepared for harvesting, just to let the worms forage around in there for any remaining bits of food or bedding or whatever might remain in the bin, so that after a little while, first of all, it would be pretty much castings only, but second of all, the worms would be really starting to crave a good meal because there hadn't been any fresh food added for some time now. So since it's been 11 days since both bins were last fed 11 days ago, I'm guessing that the food that was placed in there at that time is probably running pretty low. And if in fact I'm going to decide to stick with going for the foraging or the starving phase of this bin right here, that means today it won't even get any food. We'll check in on how the food that had been placed in there previously is coming along. But what we'll do is we'll send that down the path of giving it no food for a little while, a couple weeks maybe, until such a time that it seems like everything in there has been depleted. And then we can start thinking about trying to migrate the worms out of the material and prepare for harvesting. This bin here though, this bin is probably ready for some food. And we'll just go ahead and we'll feed this bin. It's also got a bunch of stuff in there that's really slow composting stuff, like mango pits and the seeds out of avocados and just a number of things in there that would take forever to break down. Stuff that I probably wouldn't even really expect to see break down prior to this bin being ready for harvest. So after 110 days, I would like to try to get this one geared up for harvesting too at some point soon. But for now, right now, I'm assuming that I'm going to go with feeding this bin and just inspecting this one and making sure that my decision to start the bin into like a starving mode is really what I want to do. So I'm going to put on a glove and we'll get these bins up onto the bench and we'll get to work. Alright, so the bin we're going to begin with here is the 110-day-old bin. I'm curious to see how the moisture level is doing, even though we had originally found the bin to be a bit damp, and that was the reason we had placed all of this bedding material, all these leaves in here. The conditions in here have seemed to improve, or at least it seemed that way last time I was in here 11 days ago. And I would almost even say at this point the material on the very top surface is a bit dry even, with only those sheets of paper covering the top. Normally I try to maintain the moisture level in my bins by covering with plastic, at least in the beginning I do. But once the bin starts to get a little bit more mature and you've got castings, the castings just do such a good job retaining moisture on their own that it becomes almost unnecessary to take extra measures to try to maintain moisture in the bin or try to retain moisture in the bin, because the material itself just does such a good job on its own keeping the moisture in. So even though the stuff right on the surface seems to be a little bit damp, you don't have to go very far to find stuff that's in really good shape, nice and damp. And the one thing that's always fun in those bins that do have plastic coverings is finding the worms that have come right up to the surface to try to take advantage of some of that moisture that's condensing onto the plastic that's covering things up and kind of basking in that. But since this bin doesn't have that going on, we don't get that that flurry of worms on the very top surface. But hopefully we'll find some worms when we start digging down into the area where we last fed. And for this bin, it's right down the middle. That's where the last feeding was applied. And I think I was running a little bit low on space, so even though I had most recently been bundling all the food that these bins were getting into little, kind of like little bundles of just newspaper wrapping to cover up the food, I didn't really feel like I had enough space last time I was in here, so the food just went directly in. I just poured it right into the hole here, and then I believe in went some of these slow composting items. One of them is this stem from a pumpkin, and I think we can already see another of them right here on the surface. It's a half of a, ooh, how do you like that? Of an avocado pit. And if you've ever handled an avocado pit, you'll know that they're super tough, like a marble, like a stone. So to be able to crush it like that is a little bit surprising. Although I think we've seen that happening lately in some of my bins where the avocado pits have been in the bin for some time. A couple other slow composting items are these mango pits. And I had just taken a knife and I had punched holes onto the side of these shells to try to make it easy for the worms to get in and out. So in those spots where the holes were punched, you could see worms coming and going through those holes. And I would have to assume that if we peeked inside, we would find a whole bunch of worms enjoying that pit that's in there. And it also looks like we've got some sort of other little white creepy crawlies in there. I'm not 100% sure what they are. As long as they're helping with the composting process and they're not being pests, I'm not going to worry too much about it. Some of the worms we're seeing in here are very tiny little baby worms. So I'm sure we're going to see a few more items like those. When it comes to these slow composting items, those are usually the things you'll find in my bins, is the mango pits, gradually getting broken down, becoming softer and easier to break. The avocado pits, and most everything else that gets put into the bins is usually fairly fast composting stuff, softer kitchen scraps, food that they can usually do away with pretty quickly. This is also a part of a mango seed, except in that case that mango seed had been cut into multiple pieces to try to give the worms really easy access to the material. And I believe one other thing we tried to do last time was we took a lot of this leafy matter that had been covering things up on top, and since it seemed like it wasn't really necessary anymore for that material to be in here to sop up moisture, it seemed like it would be a good idea for it to take on a new role of being bedding to go in underneath our feedings. So that's what we did with a whole bunch of leafy material in here, is we laid down a nice foundation of leaves for the food to go in on top of, and then on top of that I think we even put more leaves. So these are just some more slow composting items. It's another avocado seed. I'm wondering if it's going to break as well. Evidently not as mature as the one we just shattered by squeezing it. More mango pits. This is the stem of a banana peel. Usually the banana peel will get eaten up 1, 2, 3, but the stem is a little bit more tough. It takes more time. So I mean, this is kind of what I do usually, is I try to pick out all these slow composting items just to get a sense of how they're all progressing. Here we have a peach pit. I'm really curious to see how that's going to progress. I'm assuming it's going to take forever. And at the same time, I'm also gradually excavating a little bit of a hole so that when I do add the food, it can go in and be nice and deep within the bin. And that we'll have room so we can backfill the hole. And just basically trying to make sure that the food that's being added does not stick out through the top surface. Mango pits are always a popular spot for the worms to be hanging out in, as you can see. And I think if someday, soon I'm assuming, we're going to get to the point where we can try migrating these worms out of these bins and harvest their castings, that all of this harder, slow composting material will have to just get scooped out, and then that'll help steer the attention of the worms to all the rest of the material in the bin, so that they can work on breaking all that stuff down nicely for us. It's another little peach pit, a pretty small size one compared to the other one that's in here. Wondering if we've managed to locate all of these larger slow composting items. Nope, seems like we've still got a few of them here. Seems that the worms are not claustrophobic. They don't worry too much about crawling into stuff. I wasn't even really sure what this was. I stumbled on it last time I was in here. I just kind of like did a double take and tried to figure out what it was, and I couldn't figure it out. And I'm no closer to knowing what it is now either. But I'm not sure that that's really a slow composting item. That looks like something that the worms should be able to do away with pretty quickly. Or at least it feels like it. It's like a softer, fleshier kind of vegetable sort of a material. So I'm still finding larger stuff. Seems like sticks maybe. Those might have come in with the leaves. And I think we saw a couple banana stems. But I think for the most part we've managed to fish out most of the larger chunks of things in here. It's just a piece of bedding basically. There's some stuff that just sort of feels like it's clumped together. At first it seems like I might have stumbled on another larger object, and then it just seems like it might just be a variety of different things sort of stuck together. So yeah, I mean, I think other than all of this slow composting stuff that was put back in here and continues to get put back in every time, I think the regular feeding consisted of a lot of like leafy greens and stuff that in 11 days time would be probably mostly gone, if not all gone. So I just thought I might be able to spot a few traces of the previous feeding, but I don't think I see any. And I think we've created a deep enough ditch over here to drop all of our fresh food into today. And then we should have probably put enough stuff off to the sides that we can use to cover up with in the end. Last time I just felt like I sort of ran out of room when I piled in all the food and everything. It seemed like I was having a tough time getting it all covered back up. So we'll see how we do today. As far as bedding is concerned, it still seems to me like I've just got a huge abundance of leafy material in here. Down here at the bottom. Probably satisfactory to continue to serve the purpose of bedding, but maybe just for good measure we'll take some of the stuff that was covering the top. We'll drop it in there as the foundation for this next feeding. I think that'll just give this stuff a little bit more moisture for sure, rather than sitting on the top surface, and hopefully allow the worms to be able to get access to it, because it is moist. Because as long as it's dry, the worms aren't going to have a great deal of interest in dealing with it. So the stuff I got down here to feed them with is a bag of mixed lettuce, some sort of a kale lettuce mixture. It's pretty good actually. And some other leafy greens and stuff like that. It's all very, very small sized, tiny particles of food. So it's all stuff that should probably get gobbled up pretty quickly. And there's a variety of other things mixed in here too, in addition to that salad mix. And another thing that I bought down here was a piece of bread, which you can see is starting to develop some nice green moldy spots on it, so it's no longer edible as far as I'm concerned. And I just figured I would throw the whole thing in here, but I would try to chunk it up, break it up into a few slightly smaller pieces. Although I would like to be able to check in on how those pieces are doing. So I want to leave them big enough that if they are still here next time I check in on this bin, that I'd be able to recognize that it's chunks of the bread that had been placed in here during the last feeding. So I think that if I use pieces of bread about this size, then I should probably find traces of it in the next feeding so we could see how they did on it after whatever amount of time it is that elapses between now and then. And then like I usually do, I'll just restore all of these other food items that are in here, these slow composting seeds and stems. I'll try to keep it where all the feeding activity is going on so that hopefully it also gets some attention and gets a little bit more broken down over time. The pumpkin stem, I'll usually try to put that in the middle though, so that it's one of the first things I stumble on when I come digging in here to see how things are progressing. Most of these hard, slow composting items are somewhat bigger in size and pretty easy to find, except that one avocado seed got crushed into little pieces, and these peach pits are also kind of small. But I wanted to see if I can try to locate these pieces of avocado seed that I shattered, and I put them back down into the feeding area. Something tells me we won't be able to really pick those out of the material very much next time we come in here. I think those are going to continue to break down quite nicely. So I think from a moisture perspective, from what I've seen so far, since the feeding area is usually where you would expect to find the greatest amount of moisture, I felt like the material was pretty good as far as the dampness is concerned. So I don't think that there's really an ongoing moisture issue happening in this bin anymore. But what we'll do is we'll also scope out how things look here on the far edges too. You would have to assume that that's where you're going to find the driest of the material. At least that's where I usually expect to find the driest of the material in the bin. Partially because it's furthest away from the food, where I'm typically applying food down the middle. And the other reason being that the coverings that are usually on the bin don't go right up to the very edge. There's usually a little bit of airflow around the edges, also making me expect that the material on the very outer edges is going to be a little bit drier than what might be found in the middle. So why don't we poke down into this stuff a little bit to see how the material looks. It definitely seems nice. Sometimes I find it hard to tell whether it's moisture I'm feeling or just a large number of slimy worms. It does seem like it's got pretty good moisture content to it, but I don't know if I would consider it as being overly damp the way it had been a number of weeks ago when I originally placed all of this leafy matter in here to try to address the issue. Although somehow it does seem rather damp. But even if it's damp, it doesn't matter so much, I think, as long as it's, you know, crumbly. Although, yeah, you gotta admit, this stuff could crumble a little bit more readily. It makes me wonder if it would help if I maybe mix some of this leafy matter into this stuff over here. It wouldn't sit on the surface anymore and do nothing, basically. It would actually be combined with the somewhat damp stuff on the outer edges. Maybe sucking up a little bit of the moisture, and maybe more importantly, it would be exposed to a lot more worm activity than if it was just sitting out on the surface. So I think this might be a good way to try to get this leafy material that's been in here for a while now closer to all getting broken down. And we got a little bit here too. Maybe we'll do the same on this side if we find that the material is similar in consistency. Always finding lots and lots of worms. But yeah, you can see it's a little bit cakey, right? A little bit, it doesn't want to crumble. And that also makes me kind of think that it might benefit from having some dry bedding type material mixed into it like we did on the other side. I'm sure all the worms would appreciate having just, you know, some edible material right there nearby as well. Because I guess when it's kind of piled in thick, when it's just a whole bunch of leafy material, I treat that as kind of bedding, but when it's kind of put in there with the intention of giving the worms something to eat, I treat it more as food. So the leaves to me sort of serve that dual purpose. Really good material in the worm bins. The worms really seem to enjoy it. I have mostly maple trees around my property, so the leaves that I have are for the most part maple. And since there's been so many leaves in this container, I'd really love to see them start getting broken down a little bit more quickly. And I think doing what we just did here is probably going to help a great deal in making that happen. And this, to me, right here, these little sticks and stems of the leaves that you see so many of in here, those are usually what I treat as sort of the indicator that the leaves are truly gone. Because the soft part of the leaf, that stuff they're going to be able to eat up 1, 2, 3. It's the harder sticks and stems portions of each leaf that's going to take a long time for them to break down. Okay, well, I've used up all the food that I brought down here to feed with, because this was the only bin that I had intended to feed today. So the other bin, the younger of these two oldest red wiggler bins of mine, we're hoping to find that it's really close to being done consuming the food that it got last time, and that maybe we could just let it be, leave it be for a while so that every final scrap of food in there can truly get broken down. And then once it is, we could try to migrate the worms out of the bin and harvest their castings. So let's get that other bin up here and see how it's coming along. Alright, so considering it's been 11 days since we last checked in on this 74-day-old bin, it was only, you know, what, 63 days old at that time, meaning it was only about 2 months old. And it's usually an indicator that you got yourself a really busy, fast-moving bin when after only 2 months you start getting that sense that maybe it's time to wind the bin down and harvest its castings. And that's certainly what we've got going on here. I'm seeing a lot of cocoons scattered all over the surface. I'm not sure if they're visible on the camera, but I see a fairly dark one right there. I saw another one over here somewhere. I thought that was one. Yeah, it is. It too is fairly dark in color. Usually it's the light ones that were just recently deposited, but it's these dark ones that are close to being hatched. So here's a fairly light colored one. Not sure if they're coming through on the camera, but I do see evidence of worms, you know, mating and leaving their cocoons on the top surface there. Now here, you might remember I did mention how we were, for a while there at least, we were wrapping up their food into little paper bundles. And that is the way the food in this bin was last applied. With the exception of this apple. This apple was actually left over from the previous feeding. And we just ran into it when we last fed 11 days ago. And at that time it was fairly intact still. Didn't really have these sort of signs of getting sucked in, sort of losing mass. But I would assume that the worms have made their way into it at this point. And if nothing else, the juices are simply flowing out of it, creating a little bit of a party right beneath it. So that's what we're seeing right below it when we pulled the When we pulled the apple out, all these worms were hanging out right below the apple, enjoying the moisture and the juices and sugars all coming out of the apple as it decomposes there. And we're also starting to run into some of the bedding type materials that had been used in previous feedings. The bedding that we used in the last feeding, though, was primarily paper, newspaper. So like here, I believe, yep, we're seeing a pretty good size hunk of it. See some of the writing, paper's kind of matted onto itself. So we've got some paper bedding we can recycle here. Just trying to think of how to reassemble this bin after we inspect how things are doing. Here we've got the stem of a pumpkin, or some sort of a pumpkin-like object. This is a banana stem. So there is still quite a bit of leftover food in here. At least I'm already finding bits and pieces of it in here. Although I would assume that the materials that had been placed inside of those paper wrappers are probably for the most part depleted. There was also this one mango seed in here. I think it was the only one. While the other bin that we just checked in is chock full of mango seeds, this one has only one. So this material is really, really nice. It's definitely got a variety of different bedding type materials scattered in it all over the place. Cardboard and newspaper bits. And I think with the exception of that apple, I'm not really seeing many signs of leftover food. There was these stems and seeds, and as you know, those are slow composting items that date back well beyond the last feeding. The only things that are part of the last feeding are these bits of newspaper. I would think that these chunks of cardboard all date back to prior to that, and I know for a fact that the apple dates back to prior to that. So there's still some food in here that the worms are going to be able to continue working on. And the material's really nice. So I think I am going to stick with the idea that I had originally, which was to let this bin kind of wind down, let the worms polish off all the remaining bits of stuff that had been put in here during previous feedings. And I'm even considering, I don't know, I thought about maybe crushing that apple up into smaller bits to try to, make it easier for the worms to access the entirety of the apple instead of them having to infiltrate it through the skin. But it's always kind of interesting to see an entire object gradually get worked down by the worms. So maybe I'll just resist the urge to try to speed things along here, and I'll just let nature take its course on that apple. And there's always going to be that mango seed also, which is going to be a slow composting object, which most likely will have to just get removed at some point if we really want to let the worms finalize all the stuff that's in here. And I'm hoping that all these cardboard bits will eventually get gobbled up too. As the food supply starts to get diminished, they'll have to turn to that as their food supply. And there's a bit of it in here. Which should keep them busy, I think. So I don't think they'll get too hungry. They'll have plenty of leftovers to work on. So this newspaper on this side, I think there were 3 newspaper bundles like this put in here. This one didn't really come up as an entire chunk of newspaper like the other one did. This one seems like it's kind of been broken up into little tiny bits. Oh, maybe I'm wrong. Is that what I'm finding here? Yeah. There we go. This would be another one of those wrapped up pieces of newspaper that was enclosing food. I'm wondering if perhaps the best way to get all of this cardboard and paper type stuff really worked down is to pile it up right beneath that apple. And as the apple continues to emit its juices and drip downwards, it'll cover all of this newspaper and cardboard bits. and make all of it as almost as tempting as the apple itself. So I think that's probably one of the things we can do to try to help the paper along, to help it break down as quickly as possible at this point. So as we inspect the very edges of the feeding area, I don't really see any more food bits or bedding bits. I think we've managed to scoop out the majority of it. Like I said, there had been 3 bundles of food placed in here. And I would think that by now we would have located the majority of that paper and stashed it up here. So why don't we just inspect the stuff on this edge as well, see if we come up with any other remaining large pieces of paper that we could stick in under the apple. Paper or cardboard bits, but it is looking like we've managed to scoop out most of it at this point. Still a little bit of it here and there. Don't gotta go crazy finding every last bit of it, but I think it will do it a lot of good to have it right below the apple where the worms can really work it down. Okay, things look really good. So I usually kind of create a gully the entire width of the bin and load everything up, but since I really want to try to use that apple as sort of the juicing mechanism to kind of spew its liquid down onto all of the residual bedding material that I have here, I think I'm going to just try to focus on dropping all this stuff right down into the very middle here. And there is quite a bit of it here. So let's try to make sure we've placed it all down in here. You know, there's these other things, these banana stems, and here's another one. And there was this other chunk of something, I wasn't quite sure what it was, as well as this one mango seed that's definitely breaking down nicely at this point. Not much left for this one to get finished. Keep everything right here where the apple's going to be emitting all that wonderful juice out of itself. And I got a feeling the worms are really going to gather around the middle of this bin after all this stuff starts to break down nicely. So yeah, I think that's going to be a really popular spot for the worms to come together. So this does not count as a feeding. We're just reorganizing the material that we found, which was all components of previous feedings. So I'm going to start to move material in from the outer edges. In this case, the material on the outer edges is definitely a lot more flaky and crumbly than it was in the other bin. And you don't see all kinds of stems. I mean, you see little bits of it here and there, little bits of sticks and stems from leaves that I've used in the past as bedding. But it's been quite some time since I put fresh leafy material into this bin. So that stuff is definitely breaking down pretty nicely too. And like I said, when I start to see that the majority of that stuff has really been broken down well by the worms, that's when I start to consider the bin as being pretty close to being finished. Okay, let's start moving some of this stuff back too. Get this feeding area covered up nicely. I guess out here too, the material has a really nice consistency to it. There's plenty of worms occupying it too. It's one thing I've been finding lately is that the worms don't all just mob around the food. They also seem to enjoy just hanging out in the outskirts of the bin, even on these outer edges furthest away from where the most recent feedings had been applied. Alrighty. So it's 11 days and counting at this point since this bin was last fed. And a lot of the last feeding has certainly been depleted with the exception of the paper. And all we're really seeing in here is stuff that dates back to even previous to the last feeding. Who knows how long that's been. But I think that apple, once it gets going, it should be eaten up pretty quickly. I think it just takes a while for it to get started, but once it does get started, it starts to get broken down pretty quickly. I think all these little scraps of paper we're finding everywhere, you know, we did manage to focus the majority of it underneath that apple. So I think that's going to help that stuff break down a lot too. But I think that, you know, we are going to proceed with this concept of starving this bin, allowing the worms to forage through it and break down everything they can within the bin. And I'm even wondering if, you know, since I'm finding the moisture to be pretty much where I want it to be, I don't think I would want the stuff in this bin to continue drying out too much. I'm thinking of putting a sheet of plastic over this once again like I've done in the past. It, you know, it'll just help the moisture in the bin to recirculate and keep the very top surface of the bin pretty moist too, as opposed to getting very dry. And while it's dry, all the stuff on the surface just isn't going to get any attention because the worms won't want to be there. But if the moisture is recirculating continuously, the very top surface becomes fair game and kind of a hot spot where worms break down the material just as readily as if it were right down under the surface. So yeah, I think that's a good idea. Alright, so to cover things up, I'm going to put things back the way we found it when we first got in here. This will be kind of like our indicator to show where the food has been placed. And then back on will go this sheet of paper. But now the additional thing we're going to put on here is, you can tell it's a little bit soiled. It's a piece that's already been used for this purpose in the past. Is just a plastic bag, covering up the majority of the top, so the very edges won't benefit from being able to capture some of the moisture and recirculate it, but right here under where the plastic is located, any moisture that tries to escape the bin through evaporation will be captured by this, and it'll drop right down onto that newspaper below it, and that should make for a really cozy spot for the worms to be hanging out, and maybe even using the newspaper as a carbon food source, so we'll see. Alright everyone, that's it for today. We've now fed my oldest bin, which had not been fed for 11 days, so it just got a pretty nice feeding. And then this bin right here, also 11 days since it was last fed, is just going to continue to ride the way it is. And we'll just see how it progresses. Hopefully they'll do away with that apple and all that bedding that's in there. You know, in time, hopefully that stuff will all get gobbled up and depleted, and then we can start thinking about trying to coax the worms out of all this beautiful casting material so that it can be harvested and so that the worms can be relocated. Alright everyone, that's it for today. I got a few more things to do around here, cleaning up, putting stuff away, but I'm not going to bother you with that because that stuff's boring. Before I go, let me just really quickly say thank you. Thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate your company. If you enjoyed the video, please remember to give me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. Also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. Alright everyone, have a great day. Bye now.